initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on black. Before we get started, make sure you hit me with the HBO special. If you don't know what the HBO special is, that's the Help Your Brother Out special, and we're depending on YOU to help us get to 1,000 subscribers. So to do so, we need you to do this. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button as well as the notification bell. We're back with another video. We're talking about political theater. That is what Trump, the January 6 hearings, and what this means for what? The black community. So before we get started, I think it's very important that we kind of lay the groundwork here, right? So as we all know, the January 6 hearings has been in the news cycle for the past week or so, right? MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, even maybe your local paper, or every time you open it, they have an article based on what's going on. But before we get into that, I think we have to back up a little bit. Thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer always stated what? She taught us to what? Never forget where you come from and always praise the bridges that carried you over. And so this makes me think of when I was an undergrad, I took a class on social inequality in America. And one of the books we had to read was entitled American Society, How It Really Works. And one of the things that it talked about in the book was that both political parties, Democrat, Republican, both were funded by the same special interest groups and lobbyists. So basically what they argue is that what you really see in terms of what you see on television and print media is political theater. It's wrestling. It's WWE. It's WWF. It's Monday Night Raw. And that got me to thinking about what's taking place today, right? It also made me think about the great work of the radical historian Howard Zinn. He's passed on now. But he wrote a book in 1980 entitled The People's History of the United States of America. If you haven't read the book, I would behoove you to do so. It's a great book. It's read by a lot of high school students, even undergraduate students, when they take a history course. For many of you who are aware, typically you don't learn true history until you go into post-secondary education. Typically in secondary education, you get taught narratives such as George Washington never told a lie, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and of course, last but not least, that Columbus discovered America. When you go to college, you find out that George Washington was a nefarious individual. He was a slave master. He lost every battle he ever had, except for the one in which they crossed the Delaware River. And then, of course, that Christopher Columbus, not only did he not discover America, he traveled to the New World, and he was a enslaver, a organizer of organizer of the rape of indigenous women, and of course he was a colonizer as well. So you don't tend to really learn the nitty gritty until you get into post-secondary education. But one of the things that Howard Zinn's book really pushes, The People's History of the United States of America, is he argues that American history can largely be seen as exploitative and a manipulation of the majority by rigged systems that hugely favor a small aggregate of elite rulers from across the orthodox political parties, right? It sounds like today, right? And so he argues that historically, particularly in the media, secondary education, history is taught from a position in which there's a fundamental nationalist glorification of the country. Some examples he would give, of course, is Columbus discovering America. Talk about manifest destiny, right? But it doesn't talk about from the perspective of the people, in which who suffered under manifest destiny, right? In terms of the Trail of Tears, the genocide of Native Americans, right? Chemical warfare against indigenous peoples, right? And then, of course, we could talk about, of course, the chattel enslavement, anti-black racism, and the system of social control that black people have been facing for since we've got here over 4 or 5 centuries ago. So there's a lot to really unpack there when we look at what's going on with January 6th and Trump, political theater, and just the whole concept of how politics works and what we learn about this country and what we later find to actually be true. Another example that I could think of is, of course, is the war in Iraq. Now, we were told by the media over and over and over again that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, right? And I was in the service at this time. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. I remember Colin Powell, who was the then a Secretary of State, stating, he was not the Secretary of State, I think he was Secretary of Defense, one of the two. It's neither here nor there. Any government with a working intelligence system knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. We get to Iraq, and of course, we find that there are no weapons of mass destruction. So then it's, listen, we want to bring democracy. The Iraqi people weren't asking for democracy. Then it was, well, we want to rebuild a nation, but the nation wasn't destroyed until you got there to destroy it, right? So what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that what's being stated doesn't actually line up with what's actually taking place or transpired. And I think it's very important when we look at what's taking place with the January 6th hearings to understand that I think this is more of the same. I think this is more of a smokescreen. I think this is more of once again, the wrestling type of persona where this is scripted and the outcome has already been determined before the viewers are aware. And the reason why I state that is that the Attorney General, Garland, stated that he doesn't know if they're going to actually move forward with a prosecution of President Trump. And that got me to thinking, then why are you having all of these hearings, right? And so when we think of Trump, we're thinking of the business tycoon and TV personality who capped his improbable political journey with an outstanding victory over, of course, Hillary Clinton. Donald J. Trump was the 45th president of the United States. And of course, he defeated Hillary Clinton in 2016 when he ran a campaign rooted in, of course, bigotry, xenophobia, sexism, jingoism, and of course, white supremacy. But with that being said, the January 6th hearings are arguing that he was responsible, solely responsible for initiating the coup, initiating the insurrection. The issue I have is that when the Attorney General is coming out saying we don't know if we're going to actually prosecute him, then what's the need of doing all of this? To me, it's just pomp and circumstance. It is, of course, political theater. The reason why I state that is I'm going to give a historical example from almost 50 years ago. And I can recall Queen Mother, and she's still moving in a very strong manner. Assata Shakur, she's of course a political refugee in Cuba, right? And in her memoir, Assata, if you haven't read Assata Shakur's memoir, Assata, I would argue you need to read it. I opine that Assata Shakur's memoir, Assata, is the Black female revolutionaries version of the autobiography of Malcolm X. So please make sure you go out and get that by any means necessary. But one of the things Assata Shakur talked about in her memoir that really pushed her to become a revolutionary is when she saw the inherent inequity in American society. And one of the examples she gave is how brothers and sisters, unfortunately, living under the ravages of course, the residue, of chattel enslavement, Jim Crowism, black codes, convict leasing, and of course sharecropping, oftentimes had to struggle to make a living. And unfortunately, at times, and I'm not saying that I agree with people, no one should be committing crime, but committing petty crimes to make a living, and the individuals are getting 5, 10, 20 years, just these egregious sentences that don't align with the crime that they committed. And she talked about Richard Nixon, who in 74 was going to be facing a grand jury indictment for a laundry list of charges, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, so on and so forth. I don't know if the RICO law was back in effect then, but if it was, he could have been facing a charge for RICO because he engaged in organized crime. And then, of course, Gerald Ford, who later became president, after Nixon resigned, pardoned him before he even faced any criminal charges. Could you imagine receiving a pardon before you even face charges? So this just goes to show the amount of corruption that takes place in the higher echelon of leadership in America, particularly politically, but also the vast level of inequality in political theater that is taking place. And I think this is a prime example of what's taking place with the January 6th hearings, when the Attorney General states, I don't know if we're going to charge this guy, even though evidence is coming out every day that shows that this man was responsible for the insurrection, responsible for leading the coup, showing that he even wanted his own vice president to be hung, lynched, right? Because he was not willing to go along with the lie that the election was stolen. Shows you that this is all political theater. And so I think this what just shows to the black communities that we can't depend on the left, we can't depend on the right, we have to depend on ourselves. I know the late great John Henry Clark, who was a mentor of Malcolm X, stated that we have no permanent friends or permanent enemies. We only have permanent interests. And so as a result, I think we have to do everything that we can in the way that we can ensure that we are developing politically, economically, and of course militarily to protect ourselves from the multitude of nefarious anti-black forces here in society. So until next time, you all know what to do. Hit the subscribe and like button. Peace.